I went in straight into airside, which is the heavy end of airports, and loved it. It gets into your blood. I would struggle to see myself leaving aviation now.
Welcome to Island Influencers, where we share stories of successful business owners, experienced professionals, entrepreneurs, and community leaders based or with influence in the Isle of Man. This podcast is brought to you by Thornton Chartered Financial Planners, because great financial planning has the power to change your life. Now here's your host, Sharon Sutton.
This week's Island Influencer, Gary Cobb, the airport director at Isle of Man Airport, joins me to explain what an av geek is and share his life story from growing up in a small mining town, chemical engineering degree to aviation leadership, including roles at Gatwick Airport and Highlands and Islands Airport. Gary, along with his wife and cat, have lived on the Isle of Man since 2022. His passion for aviation and commitment to excellence are evident in every aspect of his work. In this episode, Gary opens up about his career path, the challenges and triumphs of airport management, and the pivotal moments that shaped his professional and personal life. When not overseeing operations at the Isle of Man Airport, Gary immerses himself in science fiction and fantasy literature and enjoys relaxing walks. He also shares a remarkable personal story about how he narrowly missed the devastating Boxing Day tsunami in Changi. As a member of the board of Visit Isle of Man, Gary is also dedicated to promoting the island's unique selling points, including its diverse geology and rich history. Gary's an inspirational, enthusiastic, results-driven leader. His extensive experience and leadership in the industry makes episode 117 of Island Influencers a must-listen. Thanks for joining us on this week's episode of Island Influencers, and I hope you enjoy hearing Gary Cobb's story and insights into the aviation industry. If you found this episode inspiring, please share it with your friends and leave us a review. Well, welcome to Island Influencers. I'm delighted that Gary Cobb, who's the Isle of Man Airport's director, is joining me today on the podcast. So thank you so much for travelling all the way from Ronaldsway. Yeah, welcome to Island Influencers.
Thank you for having me.
In the true spirit of this podcast and what we're trying to achieve, which is building confidence and trust in the Isle of Man community, I wonder if you'd just like to tell me all about your path to where you find yourself today. Because I was obviously doing a bit of research prior to our meeting, and I see you've got quite a history in industry, and just wondered where do you come from? Where do you hail from originally?
So from a small mining town next to Sherwood Forest, so in the Midlands. So it was a village until the Queen's Jubilee, I think in 2000, when it made a town.
Right.
Local school there, then university, Newcastle, Edinburgh, chemical engineer. Realised that I didn't want to be a chemical engineer. Into manufacturing, and then the opportunity for operational excellence came up with Gatwick Airport. So into Gatwick Airport, where I ran the airside function, so that was everything that's outside the terminal, all the plane side.
Yeah.
Heathrow got another runway as part of the planning condition, so given the opportunity to work out how to grow Gatwick, so had a look at their northern runway, which is currently going through examination now. Then into basically COVID, redundancy, fortunate to get a job up in Highlands and Islands as a chief operating officer. So 11 airports ranging from a beach all the way to Inverness, which is very similar to Ronaldsway. And then approached by the Isle of Man to come over here and put it all together and to manage the airport here.
So you arrived here in 2022?
2022, August, so just under 2 years, so very, very close to my 2-year anniversary.
Oh, goodness. Well, a belated welcome.
Thank you.
So, yeah, that's quite some interesting history there. I mean, what was it like working on such massive airports like Gatwick, for example? Well, if you compare it to, and then a sort of multi-stream airport operation with the Highlands and Islands.
So it was interesting. So Gatwick is incredibly intense. So the busiest single runway in the world, 55 movements an hour. I think in looking at heads of airside that have managed intensity of runway, there's probably only 5 people alive that have run a function that big and intense. Mm. Hyle was completely different, so not intense at all. So Barrow would have 2 flights a day, Isla and all that would have 2 flights a day, but much more complex and a much broader span of role. So looking after projects and then interfacing into communities, which was a big part of the lifeline services that Hyle did. Ronaldsway kind of puts some of that together. So it doesn't have the intensity, but it has some of the intensity around the civil service and the political aspect of it. And then it has the complexity in terms of it's a mixture of lifeline services whilst trying to be commercial enough that it can stand on its own 2 feet.
Yeah, of course, and sometimes that gets overlooked. But it says Isle of Man airports, but we know there's only Ronaldsway. So what does airports encompass?
So technically there is still safeguarding for Derby. So Derby as an airport is still safeguarded in the future should it ever be required. So I think it's a joke sometimes with the previous minister who quite liked that I was the airports director, because it kept in basically context of Derby if that should ever be needed in the future.
Interesting. Is the runway up there still intact then? Or?
So it would probably be used if there was any kind of military aid required to the island. So if for some reason Ronaldsway was incapacitated, there is fog. So there is the potential to use that. And again, it's always useful to have safeguarded space to be able to build something in the future should it be required.
Yeah. Gosh. Well, it's something that it was interesting, and I was trying to imagine myself what it might include, and I thought, well, maybe it's helipads, but maybe no. Thanks for clarifying that. Well, when you saw the advert for the Isle of Man, what was sort of your thoughts? Did you do any research before you?
Well, so I didn't actually see the advert. I was approached to offer some advice and support to the DOI on Ronaldsway Airport. I think when Annie left, so they wanted some advice. The more advice I was doing, the more interesting it became, and then it was like, well, actually, this would be quite an interesting role. If you had a look at Hyle, it's about the same size as Inverness. So Highlands and Islands airports.
Right.
So the 11 Scottish airports. So Inverness was one of the 11. This is a similar size, but actually with some of the complexities and issues faced, it was actually quite interesting. So the more I spoke to DOI, the more it was like, well, actually, this would be quite interesting role to go for. And
Annie, you said it was your predecessor, Anne Reynolds. Yeah, who many of our listeners will have known. So she stepped on, went off to new pastures new. And
this is an incredibly tough role. It probably requires quite a lot of resilience that people don't realise that there's quite a lot of negativity around the airport, which can, and Annie did it for quite a long period of time. And I know that she can get quite a lot of flack, but a lot of the decisions she made actually were pretty commonsensical.
Yeah, I enjoyed, she used to do a lot of, I don't know if you still do this, you have to forgive me, a lot of come and see air traffic control, a room in operation, how it works with the airspace, and I went along with my son as part of the Cubs, I think, at one point, which was fascinating. Are you still doing that sort of thing?
So we have an open invite for if people want to come in. We've done something, I think, recently with fire, just to try and explain actually what actually happens. I think everyone, it's like the fatigue breaks that everyone has got construed as tea breaks. People sit there and go, oh yeah, you should be able to do this and I can work an extra 20 minutes. It's only when you really go into the tower and understand how many lives are in their hands and one misspeak could actually have pretty catastrophic, that actually it starts to make sense of, well, actually I'm quite glad that my air traffic controllers their fatigue is very carefully managed.
Yeah, no, indeed. Okay, well, I mean, I think I disclosed to you before that my son is an aircraft fanatic. Well, let's say enthusiast, not fanatic.
I think the word that we typically use in industry is avgeek.
Avgeek, he's an avgeek. There you go. Wants to be an aerospace engineer. There you go, Luke. Okay, so he said, ask him, Mum, about the new livery on Logan Air, because on the photographs that you see on jet photos when you're in flight radar, up pops Logan Air with its new tail on Reg GLMTF, Isle of Man's airline. So what can you tell our listeners about that?
So something that's going to be announced probably just a bit before this podcast gets released, but Logan Air, as part of their commitment to the island, have put in a brand new livery for their Isle of Man aircraft. I think it's called Clan Manannan, and plays on basically the Isle of Man's airline. So it's part of their commitment to showing that the Isle of Man is important to what they do, and they want people to feel like there's some form of ownership within there for them.
Yeah, and our Isle of Man government, as far as you know, are they now shareholders in Loganair?
So no, there's no. It's a common one that we hear all the time of, oh, we need to start an airline.
We do. We hear it all the time.
And I think in the past, starting an airline was considerably easier than it is now. It's very hard to get an airline off the ground. So no, Loganair is a private entity. As far as I'm aware, there's no shares or anything owned. It's just we have a very good partnership with them as an airline.
Yeah, which is very important. Those of us who are islanders will know some of the history of Isle of Man Airlines. I mean, do you know the history of Manx Airlines?
So no, Manx Airlines, Euro Manx, and
Flybe
2.0 as that came in recently, and I think there might be even more. So. And to be fair, the demise of Flybe is probably one of the biggest impacts in regional air travel. So you have EasyJet with the low cost carrier with very large aircraft, 175 seaters in like the A319. Loganair with the 72-seater. And the issue that you have there is that some of the destinations just don't justify that level or size of aircraft. So it gets very difficult to find an airline that's willing to fly to some of the smaller airports like Blackpool with an aircraft size that makes financial sense.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. You see the. Do I remember correctly that Manx Airlines sold their routes? Was it Euromax sold the routes to British Regional? Part of BA.
Yeah, I think and this happens quite frequently in the past. So the big airports work on slots. So slots is you have a pair of slots where you can land and depart from an airport. The slots in Heathrow typically trade for millions. I think Manx Airlines had a pair of Heathrow slots that were worth an absolute fortune. I think they were bought by BA. BA have then taken those slots. And then, unfortunately, the airlines folded. But that's pretty common. Getting slots into some of the big airports is very difficult, which is why it would be very difficult for a new entrant airline to come in, because they wouldn't have the slots to whatever destination that we were interested in.
No, that's very true. So you mentioned before that COVID had quite an impact on you and your family. You were made redundant at the time, and you came here 2 years ago. It's 4 years on now from COVID, which is rearing its head in the air traffic controllers, I understand, at the moment. But what sort of hangover impact are you still having to deal with?
So COVID still has a massive impact. I think everybody goes, 4 years is a long time. In aviation, 4 years actually isn't very long. So aviation travel was not expected to have picked up to the level that it's expected up now. When it first happened, people were talking 27, 28 to get back to normal. It kind of got back to normal in 23. The airports, because they had no passengers, they didn't know how long this was going to go, cut quite heavily. The airlines cut quite heavily, and now they're playing catch up. You've got issues with the aircraft, so getting the spares, even getting the aircraft such as Boeing, has meant that basically everything's come together and it's kind of growing far faster than it's probably got the resilience to be able to cope with. In terms of air traffic control, training air traffic controllers is similar to like learning to drive. It isn't something that they go into a classroom, we can just give them a course and then they're fully qualified. They can come over, but people sit there and go, I've got a heart surgeon from the UK, they've come to the Isle of Man, they can operate the next day. The best way of trying to do an analogy of that is you've got a heart surgeon in the UK. For an air traffic controller, it's all about anatomy. So you've got a surgeon that knows the anatomy of the heart. If they've got the anatomy of Manchester, they come over here, it's more like the brain. So you've got this completely different level of surgeon.
It's a really good analogy.
So a heart surgeon coming to the Isle of Man to be a brain surgeon is probably going to take 6 or 7 years. It's exactly the same with an air traffic controller. On top of that, they learn like you're learning to drive. So they'll sit next to an experienced ATCO that mentors them, trains them, shows them what everything's running. In COVID, unfortunately, you couldn't really sit next to each other, so training stops. You also need to actually...
Is that why there's more of a worldwide shortage of air traffic controllers now?
Yeah, so training...
pilots?
Yeah, so training kind of stopped. You had a whole host of redundancies that had been made. I think that stopped training for 2 years and made a lot of their trainees, and now it's suddenly just all coming together. And with 3 or 4 years to get people validated, there isn't an immediate solution.
That's quite a long lead-in time, isn't it? And what about incentives to stay? Are they? I mean, without going into details, are there incentives for these people to hang around? Do they have decent, notice periods on an employment contract, that sort of thing?
So notice periods are quite low. I think that's pretty much common across all of civil service, because ultimately as civil servants, and we're quite unique in being civil service airport. In the UK, you can't actually be government run. You can be shareholder owned, but the run as private industry. So, but here we mirror the same notice period as the rest of it. So 3 months. We're quite lucky that the majority of our ATCOs are homegrown. And you have two types of ATCOs. You have your ab initios that are basically students that are homegrown from here. They'll come, they'll train, and you'll take them through. And then you have experienced ATCOs come in. The homegrown ATCOs take a long time to train, 3 to 4 years. Yeah. Experienced ATCOs you can probably do in 18 months if the rock stars. But again, it's very difficult. One of my frustrations has been with all of the negative social media around ATCOs is these are the people that we want to keep.
Yes.
Yet these are the ones who are getting all the abuse online. And these guys could go and double their salary if they wanted to. So rather than driving them away, it becomes far easier just to actually sit there and go, they're here, they're working within the rules they've got, they're doing a hard job. Yeah. They kind of should be applauded. Aim the flak at me almost, not at the air traffic controllers.
Talk to me. Yeah, okay. That's a worthy message there. And you mentioned the fact that it is quite an unusual setup in that it is government owned. Do you think there's an opportunity for the Isle of Man Airport to be privatised at some point in the future?
So it's stuff that's going through Tynwald at the moment. I think there was a push and lots of different options to have a look at an operating model for the airport, not privatised as in completely left to somebody else, but whether it's run as a government department, whether it's run, should we say, as a stat board, so similar to the post office, or whether it's run arm's length as a limited company, but with the shareholder owned, but 100% owned by the government. People sit there and go, well, what's the benefit? The only benefit that I see is airports aren't necessarily very much akin to the rest of the civil service. When you have a look at what you would expect your government to do, it's all about equity, fairness. You don't want to negotiate your personal tax rates. It should be flat and fair for everybody. With an airport, you almost want to be commercial. So the more money we can make, the less of a burden on the taxpayer it becomes.
And the more you can invest into infrastructure, I guess.
Yeah. And you can do slightly different things. So that's a current debate that's ongoing.
I'm sure. We've got this massive project in the Mersey, haven't we, that's hemorrhaging money from what... I mean, it's probably another myth, but from what you can read, it looks like... Maybe I should speak to the ports director as well. So, you see that's going on. And I just wonder, you mentioned infrastructure, the terminal's a bit tired. If you're travelling through there a lot, the people do the best job they can with what we have. And I don't think anyone's gotten a complaint with going through security because it's just really fast if you compare it to anywhere else if you're a seasoned traveller. But things like runways and, is there a... Because I know, again, having what is it, a plane geek?
Avgeek.
Son, just wonder, is there some way you can allow... Is it the Neo to be able to land? Because they can land without pilot intervention if there's fog. So I just wonder, because we get a lot of fog in Ronaldsway, not in Derby, ironically. Hey, are you going to open Derby? No, but is there a landing? Is there landing lights that we could upgrade that would allow that to happen?
So again, this is the common myth.
Myth, Grace.
Yeah, so instrument landing system is made of multiple components. You have a localizer, which gives you basically a straight line down the centre line. Mm-hmm. You have a glide path that will give you a 3-degree slope, although in one of our directions we can't do that because we're 3.5. And then you have a DME, so distant measuring equipment, which sits in the middle, which is just like a ping where they know exactly where the runway is.
Yeah.
People sit there and go, oh, it's a Neolithic ILS. It's been rehabilitated. Our ILS, the actual system itself, could do Category 2, which would be a lot better than what we have now. You've got approach lights, which were shortened as they extended the runway. So they put in the RESAs, so the runway exit safety area, which again is something that people sit there and go, oh, you don't necessarily need, but the more safety you have next to the sea or going into a road, the better. So we have all of that. We could get to category 2. It's less worrying about your approach lights. They're kind of behind you or in your 100 feet. It's what you can see in front of you.
Yes.
So it would just have to be a lot of investment in lighting in the runway. But again, it's money. So the amount, I think the common myths of the amount of flights that are cancelled due to low visibility, for the sake, we could probably upgrade to a Cat 2 ILS for about 15 million quid, but you're probably going to save about 10 or 15 flights a year. Do you spend that 10 to 15 million pounds on an ILS saving 10 to 15 flights, or do you do it on a school, hospital?
Yeah, no.
So in terms of, and to be fair, that's what the tough choices that the politicians have to make. We are in the process of doing a master plan that will feature in the master plan of a Cat 2 ILS. It's relatively marginal over whether the benefit is worth it. Although, as it gets warmer, you're more likely to see fog for longer. So Jersey can get fog bound for quite a period of time. Jersey's ILS is currently Cat 1. Ours is Cat 1. So we have the same ILS as even London City, which is Cat 1. Our approach lights are basic, but that's because they've been shortened. If we went to Cat 2, we would just be putting lights into the runway.
Right. Okay.
But our ILS system that we rehabilitated wouldn't need replacing. That is perfectly able to cope with that. And then it's relying on the aircraft to be able to have some form of auto land, which I think Logan Air can do, and EasyJet can, they fly into the Cat 3B places. So
yeah. Yes, they sure do. Okay, that's really fascinating. Thank you for the explaining around that mythology there. So the word monopoly has been thrown around quite a bit when describing airlines from the Isle of Man due to the lack of competition and high prices and comparisons to the UK-based flights. Is there active encouragement by the Isle of Man for more airlines to service Ronaldsway or more routes using the same airlines? I think this is probably a throwback to the fact that, Flybe had all those routes, but I mean, reading between the lines and what you've already said, it seems like we're still building back from COVID and getting routes like Leeds, Bradford and Stansted and Luton back. Supply and demand, isn't it?
Yeah, and our airlines are commercial, so they will fly where they think there's money in the demand. At the moment, there isn't necessarily demand. We actually have a relatively decent amount of routes for the size of airport we are. Speaking to EasyJet, they have no plans on doing any form of European routes direct from us. We always talk to them to try and convince them otherwise. But they see us as a spoke into the hub of either Gatwick or Bristol to be able to fly, although Bristol's starting to become seasonal as the traffic volumes on that route go down. Logan Air, much more consistent year round.
Yes.
But for regional flights, and I think there's lots of stuff that people can read online, the cost of flying regional routes like an ATR 72, the size of Logan Air, it comes at a higher cost. It's normally much more consistent because you're paying for a level of consistency. EasyJet don't have very much resilience in, but that's why the tickets are low cost. I think people sometimes need to work out of what product do they want to buy and not conflate all the different products together. They want a Ferrari for the price of a Mondeo. Well, actually, do you want consistency or do you want really, really low cost?
Yeah, I know. It's as a fairly seasoned traveller myself, have you just add all your luggage and stuff into EasyJet? Are you comparing like with like would be the challenge, I would say.
And I think EasyJet have a place to play in the market, and they have their supporters, and then Logan Air have their supporters. For me, it's about how do we get lots of different products that everybody want. You've got the Jersey route that we've got for business. You have a lot of people sit there and go, oh, that's really expensive and it's not designed for leisure. And it's like, well, the airline hasn't designed that for leisure. The airline have designed that for flying to
convenience,
business for Isle of Man to Jersey, and they've picked the times that would suit businesses to be able to commute between the two.
Yes, time is money in a business. Yeah, I get that. And then, of course, we've got going the other direction. We've got Aer Lingus, who are making a welcome kind of return with different routes. They've got Belfast as well, haven't they?
So unfortunately, they'll be pulling off Belfast. We've just not had very much take on Belfast. So the numbers on Belfast just don't necessarily go there. And EasyJet are in the same boat of they just struggle to make it work.
Yeah.
Dublin is much healthier. So Dublin started off as 1 a day. It's now gone to 2 a day. And their numbers are starting to get healthier. The good thing with routes as they get healthier is the times of those routes actually get better. So people sit there and go, oh, I want to get into Dublin early so I can pass through TSA and get to the States. well, the more a route becomes popular, the more yield that the airlines get it, the more they sit there and go, well, actually, we're going to make money on that. We'll put it in a more prime slot, and it grows. The flip side works with something like the Bristol, where as it becomes less popular, it gets moved slightly out of the peak times. Less people use it, and it can go into it. So
yeah, it's entirely commercial. So you vote with your people. You vote with your feet, people.
Yeah, and so it's use it or lose it. And these are commercial operators. We try our hardest to work with them. But ultimately, if there isn't the demand, they're not going to put the plane on.
No, of course. No, that makes complete sense. Well, look, if it's all right with you, I'll kind of move on to finding a bit more about you now, since we've gone straight into airports and what it's all about, without getting to know you, Gary, and all about you, and really. If you don't mind me asking, when we do this podcast with people, because I'm a financial planner, it's just really what does true wealth mean to you, and rich or wealthy, those sort of words, and kind of leading to that, I guess based on how money was for you growing up. So how did you grow up? What was it like for you? What's your earliest memories? So
probably a small mining town. So my dad's a gas man, mum worked in as dinner lady until we left school, and then a care home. So I think money was tight. I remember my dad working incredibly hard for the money we had. One of the earliest memories is I think I had a teacher that said, "Oh, actually, Gary's quite smart. He's probably going to go to university," which for my family, I was the first in my family to ever have been looked at for university. So I think my dad then went into overdrive of, okay, need to save this and save that. And so one of the first memories of is my dad just creating lots of pockets of savings. Oh, Gary's going to go to university. My little brother might go. My sister might go. And then him doing the financial planning for that. And even to this day, when he's got all these little pots of money that he can somehow find.
That's incredible. And how is that sort of transposed to today? Do you find yourself adopting similar habits?
Not as much. So I probably find myself in no kids, so me, my wife and a cat. So probably not having the same financial burden of 3 children. But it's an element of trying to conserve what we've got, not trying to splash out. So I tend not to go too extravagant. And some of that is just the conserving the money and making sure that it's there for a rainy day.
Yeah, that sounds like great business management for the airport as well. Well, thank you for sharing that. So of all the things you've done throughout your busy career, because we haven't mentioned things like tarmac and things like that you've worked for over. I mean, look at just a stalk. You get a lot of people stalking you on LinkedIn now. It's a fascinating career. So, what's given you the most fulfillment from a career perspective?
So I think it has been aviation. So I was quite lucky. So as I said, you
didn't like chemical engineering.
Yeah, and
why not?
So I suppose the school I went to actually. It struggled, so I actually did very well in my school, although I came out with what most people would class as poor A-levels. Didn't do particularly well in chemistry and maths. Wanted to be good at chemistry and maths, so I did chemical engineering. I'm now much better at chemistry and maths. Whether I wanted to be better at chemistry or maths is probably another thing. So did chemical engineering, realised that I didn't want to work with processes, wanted to work with people. The Tarmac graduate scheme was a management graduate scheme. And again, I learned quite a lot of that. So into Tarmac just as the first financial crisis happened. So I then spent time in like a McKinsey rationalization where they brought in on like a McKinsey team. So that opened my eyes to some of the management consultancy, a different way of thinking, which then went into lean change management, which...
Yeah, what particularly inspired you? Was there a particular event that...
So I think... getting picked to go on to some of the McKinsey change agents of, we've got this big problem, we have all of these plants, the financial crash has happened, no one's building, what do we do? And it then turned into a process problem, but with people. So how do you rationalise, how do you get more out of the people that you've got? And that became quite interesting, of marrying chemical engineering up with leadership. I then found that Tarmac really started to struggle, so they were moving me into IT. I'm probably not the particularly greatest in IT, so I then went to Reckitt, study pharmaceutical, and then probably one of the best organisations I ever worked for was Mars, which was family owned, and they really do live their values.
Mars,
Mars is in the Mars bar, but also I think they are the world's largest provider of pet food, manufacturer of pet food.
Well, who knew?
Nestle, number 2.
Right.
So
okay.
Mars and Nestle pretty much own the pet food. But the values of Mars were really, really good. They live their values. And then an opportunity came up to go into Gatwick. Gatwick was owned by GIP. One of their operating partners was, don't want aviation people, let's mix it up, and brought in some operational experts, as they called that. I went in straight into airside, which is the heavy end of airports, and loved it. It gets into your blood. I would struggle to see myself leaving aviation now.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just, I don't know, it's just... Yeah, you're all the same. You av geeks,
and you have a look. You'll see planes. It gets into the blood. So,
yeah,
and in fact, most people that you meet, once you start to show them an airport, they love it. They find it absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely. I met brothers. He's a captain on EasyJet and an instructor for Airbus and examiner, and it's just all in the family. So it's great having an aircraft heavy. Podcast recording. This is going to be interesting for you, but I'm looking for a really good answer, because you are an organisation leader. So, what would be your number one tip to anybody who finds themselves in this sort of leadership role?
I suppose it's two. So, for those growing up, the best bit of advice I was given, which I still follow, is always pick the hardest jobs. So, whenever you have an opportunity, don't sit there and think, "Oh, that's really hard. It's not going to look very good." Just go for it. So in Tarmac, my first leadership was in the middle of industrial action. I've then gone into product recall, and you come to the Isle of Man, which I knew exactly what I was taking on when I came, which is there's an airport that needed some work, and you have to take it from A to B. So you put yourself doing the tough jobs. You find that you eventually you grow with it, and then the second thing is trust your team. You can't do it all on your own. You see too many people who try to do it on their own without actually just surrounding yourself with good people. Yeah.
No, that's a really good one. We call it eat the frog, eat the big frog first. Yes, and yeah, trusting your team is that's the best thing ever.
They'll never do it the way that you want to do it, and you'll sit there and think, oof, but it normally works out better than the way that if you'd have done it yourself.
Yeah, there you go. So if you could go back and give your 18-year-old self a bit of advice, what would you say? Would he listen?
I think I'd have probably said to go into aviation sooner rather than... But then, to be fair, I kind of finding my way into aviation the way I did has probably helped me the most. I think the other bit of advice that I would have probably given myself is be a little bit more mobile straight away. So coming from Ollerton, I always wanted to leave Ollerton, but the world wasn't a very big place. The world has got a much smaller place as I've moved on in my career. And you sometimes sit there and go, actually, if I'd have known that sooner, would I have done something different?
Yeah. No, very good. And what do you do to relax when you're not running airports?
Airports is my hobby. No. So I quite like reading, and I quite like mainly just walking. I think people sit there and go, "Oh, do you hike anywhere really special?" Not particularly. I think one of the good things with the Isle of Man is there's a lot. Like I love Glen Helen. It's just nice to go completely switch off, and just the act of walking just allows your brain to go free, switch off, and to recharge.
Which part of the island do you find yourself living in?
So when I came here, I originally lived in Ramsey, but that was mainly through bringing a cat and not very many options of getting a house. And everyone's like, well, you live in Ramsey, it's absolutely nuts to travel to the airport. It was actually a very pretty drive, 37 minutes, and you could switch on and switch off. I now live Crosby, so in the centre, but me and my wife still go up to Ramsey quite a lot. Beautiful part of the island.
It is, yeah. I've done the same myself. Lived from Ramsey to Moran. There you go. And what's your favourite trip you've ever taken?
Favourite trip? Ooh. So probably when I first met my wife, she was just travelling around the world. So I got to go to New Zealand for about 8 weeks with her, and then Malaysia, Singapore, and some of Southeast Asia, which for a 23-year-old straight out of university, not really left the UK, that was quite eye-opening.
I'm sure it was. What did you think of Singapore?
beautiful. And I went pre-Changi being the airport that it is now. So at some point, I'd quite like to go back and see. So saw Changi, whatever it was, 20 years ago. In fact, I was out there just as the tsunami hit, the Boxing Day tsunami. We were meant to be on the beach, but we'd got delayed, fortunately. But Changi was not necessarily the airport that it is today. So going back and having a look at the Changi that it is would be really, really good.
Yeah, gosh, that was a lucky escape.
Yeah, I must admit, we got delayed. I think we had Christmas dinner rather than going to Penang and having it on the beach, we'd gone and stayed in Kuala Lumpur. I think we'd gone for Christmas dinner, had some drinks, and came back must have had about 300 missed calls. I rang my mum, burst into tears, and it's like, what's wrong? And it was like, there's Boxing Day. It's like, well, actually, we're safe. Didn't feel it.
My goodness, yeah. Yeah, it's rarely talked about that now, but it was a massive catastrophe at the time. Still is.
Well, and we saw, because we were in that region the days afterwards, so you saw the devastation that it had caused, and the amount of work that in that point the Malaysian government was doing, just even on Penang, not even in the Thailand side of it, but there was quite a lot of clear up and rescue. So it was quite sobering.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's a sobering story. It turned into So hopefully you do get back and.
No, absolutely. I think Changi. You've got Changi and you've got Doha. So Hamad is Hamad is now the best airport in the world, just taking its crown from Changi. So it's always good to go and see what the best do. Yeah.
So because of your role, do you think you can get like a, backstage pass or whatever they call it?
I think I'd have to fund it myself, but I've got contacts in lots of different airports, it would be easy to go and see. But
fact-finding mission.
Well, and aviation is such a small world. So my old number 2 is now in Dubai. I know somebody who's just gone out to Doha. You see lots of people, predominantly Gatwick, should we say, that have then spread and gone into lots of other different airports around the world.
Yeah. And you're in the Isle of Man. So what do you think are the best things about living here, given that clearly there's a choice of the world out there? So
I think the one thing about the Isle of Man, and I'm quite lucky, I sit on the board of Visit Isle of Man, and it's a conversation I have of how do you describe the Isle of Man? What do you try to sell? So if you went to Iceland, you can sell it. If you go to Orkney, which my wife's from, you can sell it. If you went to the Maldives, the one good thing about the Isle of Man is it's got a different feel all over. So you're not just trapped up, I'm just going to go and look at the geology. You've got like the heritage side of it, you've got the history, archaeology side of it, and then you've got the natural rugged landscapes, which, to be fair, is probably my favourite. But going onto a beach just near Point of Air, which you've got to yourself, is quite rare when you come from the UK.
Yes, that sounds quite special. Okay, so what are other than money to spend on whatever you want at the airport, what's the main challenges that the Isle of Man faces?
So, well, we spoke about money, and that's probably my main one. I suppose the other one is probably trying to combat some of the negativity. I think sometimes people on the Isle of Man don't necessarily realise how much of a ramification their negativity can have. So using EasyJet, everyone's like, EasyJet's going to leave the island, EasyJet's going to leave the island. EasyJet, whenever we sit them, have no intention of leaving the island. One of the things that might cause EasyJet to leave the island is they get really, really upset with the amount of people that sit there and go, EasyJet are going to leave the island. Because as soon as that gets into the press, people stop booking EasyJet, the number of people flying goes down, and those routes start making less money, and it becomes a horrible, vicious cycle for them. Yeah. And they're sat there going, why are we creating this artificial lack of faith in travel? And they just don't know necessarily how to sit there and say, we're not leaving. Like Logan Air, it's the fly, use air travel, we're not going to leave.
Look, we've got 3 legs on our aircraft body now.
Yeah, and as Logan Air do, Manx's airline. So I think some of it is trying to not to shoot ourselves in the foot. You see it with the steam packet. So I speak to Brian relatively frequently. We both sit on the board of Visit Isle of Man, and you have with the steam packet like the Which report saying it's the worst ferry company in the UK. My wife's Orcadian, so I've gone on all of those. I've come from Scotland with the ferries that you have in Scotland. So I've travelled on quite a few ferries around the UK. This is not the worst ferry in the UK, but it's voted as. And all that happens is I'll go home and everyone's like, oh, it's got the worst ferry service. Oh, it's got the worst. So we're almost causing this negativity that stops people from wanting to come and actually have a look at it. And don't get me wrong, from an airport, I share people's frustrations that there are things that we need to do with like air traffic control and make it much more consistent. But it's almost this vicious cycle of downward spiral makes it more difficult to fix it.
Yeah, no, that's well said, and entirely the angle of this podcast is, like I said,
And I suppose the only other point I'd say about that is so Inverness has won the Airport Council International's best airport in Europe twice over, for under 2.5 million passengers. So I've managed that one for 2 years. I've managed this one for 2 years. There is not that much difference between the two airports, or not enough for everyone to sit there and say this is the worst airport and that's the best airport. And I think some of that is just perception. That the people in the Highlands have a lot of pride in the fact that they have an airport. It's trying to get the people on the Isle of Man to have some pride in the fact that they've got an airport, and absolutely take on board what people want to do to fix it. But normally what you read is not necessarily very constructive.
No. Well, everyone's got an opinion, haven't
Absolutely.
they? Yeah. So what solutions, an opportunity? Well, it's an opportunity right there. How do we enter for that award?
So I suppose first of all, and it's interesting because a lot of those awards are kind of voted for by passengers. When I first joined, actually, I went to speak to all the passengers, and you speak to all the passengers and they sit there and say, it's actually a really quaint airport. Security is absolutely fantastic. They're quite friendly. You can get through very quickly. It's very small in scale, so you can literally get from car park to airport door very, very quickly. It's quite quirky, and you've got the 3 legs of man outside. So they all loved it. You see some of the locals and it's like, oh, it's awful. It doesn't do this. It doesn't do that. And there's such a massive disconnect between almost the local perception of it and then people who fly everywhere else. And it's trying to work out what expectations is. So absolutely we could be as good as Doha or Changi if you spent the money to be as good as Doha and Changi. Absolutely we could be like a Gatwick, which is almost what they call the bus stop one, which is you can turn up 30 minutes before your flight and get onto the plane. You don't have very much money. You don't kind of decided not to do that. You just want to get through as quickly as possible. The problem is there's a mismatch between the expectation that people have and the level of budget, shall we say, that we've got. And it's trying to marry up of, here's the budget we've got. What's your expectations? Do we either get more money to meet your expectations, or do we lower everyone's expectations to the budget that we've got? And happy to go either way. And naturally, I'd like a much nicer airport, probably much more resilient. But again, resilience comes at cost.
Yeah, it does. It's easy to be negative.
Absolutely. And
negative people are noisy. We know that. It's the silent majority that, sometimes is the ones that need the galvanising.
And this isn't, and sometimes it's not even, because everyone's like, oh, the airport director doesn't like criticism. It's like, absolutely, criticism's fine if it's constructive. So this airport would be far better if you did X. We might not be able to do X, but at least it's like, okay, we kind of know what people want rather than, oh, Ronald's very rubbish. Okay.
Like I said, it's easy. It doesn't cost them anything, does it? Oh, okay. So what have you got planned next then? What's the big plan other than the reveal that will happen before this podcast goes out?
So I suppose the journey that the airport's on, it's probably got 2 big things that it's got to do. One is it needs to work out its operating model. So how arm's length is it from government? Does it stay government? Does it actually go more arm's length? People have worry of, that just means that they're going to do costs or they're going to do all of that. And it's a little bit more holistic than that. Of it's like, well, how is the governance of the airport? Who's going to make the decisions? How are they going to make the decisions? The second bit is the master plan, which is for the next 15 years, what do we want to do? How does the airport want to be? Those 2 things are kind of married. A new board have come on board and are involved in the master plan. At some point, the target operating model will have to go to Tin World, and as part of that will come a master plan of here's where our vision is for the next 15 years. Fortunately, I've got lots of people who have passed on feedback of what they like to see, so some of that goes in there. So an ILS Cat 2 is in there, but it goes in with a cost. So I suppose sometimes like fancy football, you can you can try and have a football team with Messi and Ronaldo in it, but it's going to cost a lot of money. If you want one, you're going to have a compromise in the other. And it's trying to work out the compromises.
Yeah. Thank you. So just moving on to a last few fun questions that you'd be relieved to know. But what are any books you've read recently?
So my books tend to be science fiction and fantasy. So I was quite lucky as a kid. I used to read quite a lot, and the teachers, to try and stop me from getting bored, I moved on to Greek mythology, which was the stories behind that were really, really good. And then so naturally migrated on to science fiction and fantasy. So pretty much most of the books that I read, unfortunately my wife's the same, is science fiction and fantasy.
Oh, wonderful. Do you like any authors in particular? Asimov? Or?
So I'm currently reading Feist, so Raymond E. Feist. So some of his books, Magician, and the series
Shannara,
from that.
Is it?
So that one's The Magician, I think it was Brooks did Shannara, but they're quite good books.
That's right, he did, yeah.
But even to some of the urban fantasy, like Dresden Files, Jim Butcher is a really, really good series. Harry Potter, you can't go wrong with Harry Potter.
No, you can't, can you? No, not unless you are very much against J.K. Rowling these days, which I don't understand that either. Movies, are you a movie buff?
So not as much on the Isle of Man as I probably was before, in that we used to go quite a lot, mainly just we went to the giant living where we did near Gatwick. We were next to Blue Water, so it was quite easy to go. Again, it tends to be more either science fiction or even into like some of the Bourne Identity, the kind of thriller action movies are quite good. So I suppose most of the stuff that I like to do is almost just getting away from some of the reality.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I know what you mean. Favourite quote that you live by, don't you? Or just
keeping probably going to science fiction, probably Yoda, the do or do not, there is no try. Yeah. I think is quite a good way to live your life. So
yeah, definitely. And if people want to go to anywhere to learn more about you, where would they do that? Your LinkedIn profile is pretty good.
LinkedIn profile, Facebook, I kind of come off Facebook because of some of the negativity. But again, I suppose it's probably even just the coming and approaching. One thing that we try to do at the airport is we always are relatively open. So it's make contact, more than happy to have conversations. And we have a surprising amount of people who come in and actually have a conversation. Or thought about this, and you explain and actually you can come to, that's a really good idea. We might not be able to do it that way, but here's something that we can do. Because people sit there and go, oh, you don't need security. And you start going, well, if you want to stay in the cabin and travel area and there's some bad people around, you might not see them on the Isle of Man, but you don't necessarily want to make it so it's really easy for them. But once you explain some of that, it's like, but actually we can try and fix some of that by doing. So coming and having a chat is probably the easiest one, or LinkedIn. I think that gets shown around on social media every so often anyway, so it's probably relatively public. Yeah,
yes, sure. And so people will contact you through the Isle of Man government website?
Yeah, so if
website?
approaching through the airport, a lot of people kind of just send emails to me, so my email address must be relatively public because I get quite a lot of emails. So
gov.in.
Yeah, so anyone who wants it, so gary.cobb@gov.in.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Gary, for coming along today and myth busting and giving us some really great insight and positivity about how we can help the Isle of Man be more successful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening this far. I hope you found this episode to be valuable. If so, I'd like to ask you for a small favour. Would you please go to Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review, because that's one of the best ways for others to find the series, and please send a link to the podcast to 3 friends or colleagues who know they'll find it helpful. That way we can spread the word about how great a place the Isle of Man is to live and work, and help spread some positivity. Thanks again for tuning in and being part of our great community. I'll see you next time. Island Influencers is a fortnightly podcast. Make sure you don't miss the next episode by clicking the follow button on your podcast platform. A big thanks to the producer Catherine Watts from Social Cues and editor Martin Bamford at Bear Content, and thank you for listening.